Hey everybody, Jake here from Bearded Gear, and I have a bit of a showdown to do real quick. This is one that was recommended that I do, and I hadn't even, pardon me, just drank a whole yerba mate. I hadn't even really thought of making this comparison until my buddy, YD Knives, who loaned me the Sigil among several other knives, recommended that I kind of compare these two. And as soon as he said it, I was like, I think that is kind of a worthy comparison to do. So, in my left hand, I have the Koenig Arius. This, no secret, is my favorite folding knife that I currently own, have ever owned, period. It's my favorite folding knife. I adore the Koenig Arius. In this hand is the Microtech Sigil. The Sigil surprised me. I had a strong sensation that I was going to like the Sigil, but I love the Sigil. It is a fantastic titanium frame lock flipper with a hole for deployment as well, and it's definitely my favorite Microtech. The more I've thought about it, it's like there's no other Microtech I would rather have than this one. So I think it's worth pitting them up against each other in the same format that I typically do this kind of thing in. So I wrote a list down there so I don't forget anything. I'm going to do just like usual. First, we're going to talk about price between these two, what the difference is there. Then we're going to go through looks, action, ergos, fit and finish, value, carry, and cutting. I'm going to assign them each a point for each category if they win it, 0 points if they don't. In the case of a tie, which may happen probably once here if I really think about it, then they will each get a point. So maximum points they can get per category is 1, but if the other one beats it, they get 0. So that's the way I'm scoring it. I feel like that's a pretty simple way. With 7 categories, we're going to have a winner at the end of this. So you'll know which of these I recommend over the other. But before I jump in, both of these are absolutely fantastic knives. So let's start with price. The Arius, there's definitely some variance depending on which version you get. This one is a Gen 4. All the Gen 4s come standard with internal milling, so lightning pockets. It's a little bit dirty from me carrying it. Anyways, it has lightning pockets. This one has the polished flats, or I think they're hand rub flats. I don't know if it's quite polished. Satin flats. I don't know. It has satin flats and not satin grinds. I forget what they call this finish on the grinds, but it's kind of like a blasted finish. And this one is about as basic as you can get an Arius these days. This one, brand new, I think was $575. I got it secondary from a friend. It might have been $550. I paid $575 for it. A lot of the times on the secondary, these go for pretty drastically more than they were new at the drop, because when they do drop some of these, when retailers get a batch of them, oftentimes they are gone pretty immediately. They go super fast. You can also take these to crazy heights in terms of materials and different finishes and things that get them very, very expensive. But I'm going to do it based on the one that I have. This is the one that I most recommend because I feel like right here is the sweet spot for the Arius in my opinion. I love it in the full titanium construction. I like the weight, the feel, everything about this knife the way it is right here. Would I love to one day have a fancy one as well? Sure, of course I'd like to have another Arius, but this is the one I own for a reason. So this one, let's call it, for sake of illustration, $600 in case that's what they cost now, or I don't know. Between $550 and $600. I'm going to call it $600 to be safe for this version of the Arius. Now, the Sigil, they haven't made in a couple of years. So when I looked on Blade HQ, I tend to use that as kind of an encyclopedia of pricing. This exact Sigil and the apocalyptic finish, the way this one is set up, I found one of their older listings for it. I like that on Blade HQ's site they keep the price up even after a knife has sold, because it helps me when I'm determining a value on a knife, if I'm selling it, etc. They're not the only site that does that, but they make a pretty good encyclopedia if you're just looking for info. So I looked this one up. It was listed on there as $390. I am not positive what secondary pricing is like on these. but I know from what I've observed, there's a pretty decent amount of demand for them. I don't see them pop up very often, and when they do, I tend to see them move pretty quickly. I'm not positive what the last one I saw go secondary went for, so I'm just going to assume that we're calling this knife about $400. I imagine it's at least holding its value since they're scarce and there seems to be demand for them, so I'm going to call this a $400 knife. If I'm off a little bit on either of these, I apologize, but based on my quick searching, that's what I could find out. So we've got about a $200 gap between the Arius and the Sigil, with the Arius being substantially more expensive. I mean, that's a big increase between the two. So let's start with all of that in mind. The first category I'm going to grade on is looks. Now, both of these knives, in my opinion, look absolutely gorgeous. I really, really like the aesthetics of both of them. The Sigil, I mentioned a lot in my first impressions and my review. The proportions of it are just fantastic. This one is a 3.75 inch blade, and the amount of handle that you have here for how much cutting edge you get, I love the balance of how much blade length you get for the size of the handle, and every time that I deploy this knife and open it, it's like it surprises me a little bit how much blade comes out of there. Really, really like that. I like the design of the milling on the handle. I'm not usually a big, aggressive acid stonewashing kind of guy, but Microtech's apocalyptic finish on this knife just works great for it. On the clip side, you've got a good looking clip. You've got this awesome copper over travel stop / pivot ring thing. It's like teardrop shaped. It's just all really cool. I dig a warning. I like the shape of the eye and the blade. The hardware looks good, even if it's not my favorite to have proprietary hardware on the knife. It just aesthetically is a fantastic looking knife. I love the way this knife looks. Now the Arius, on the other hand, I also happen to freaking adore the way that the Arius looks. I think this design is probably, I don't know, it might be a little more polarizing than the Sigil. I've certainly heard a few people say that they didn't like the looks of the Arius. They think it looks a little funky. I personally love the looks of the Arius. Before I ever got an Arius, I drooled over it on the internet for a long time. I just think it looks amazing. I love the proportions of it. I love the shape of the handle. I like the shape of the blade and how tall it is. I like the way that the flats kind of accentuate the blade. The way that the grinds are done with this hollowed out swedge. It's phenomenal. You've got this amazing fuller here. Everything about this knife aesthetically, I really, really dig. There's nothing on this knife that aesthetically I would want to change. Not a thing. So this is going to be the one category, I think. We'll see when I get towards the bottom of the list, but I think this is the only category where I'm going to call it a tie, because both of these knives, in my opinion, just look amazing. I love the aesthetics of each of them. They photograph well, they look amazing in person, they have a certain quality about them that to me, they're very pleasant to look at. So, looks is going to be a tie. The second category is action. Now the action on these, they're both titanium frame locks running on bearings, but they feel very different from one another. I mentioned in my review of this, and I think in my first impressions, that the action of these bearings, it feels different from any other bearing knife that I've ever played with. And the best way I can kind of describe it is that most bearing knives feel very, very glassy smooth all the way through, and when you're actuating the knife, when you're using the flipper or the hole, whatever you're using to deploy it, it's like it snaps from closed to open, and there's nothing in between. It's like magically it goes from closed to open on a good, well-dialed bearing knife. On this one, the deployment is still very solid in terms of I've never failed to deploy this knife. It always goes how I want it to, but the whole way through I feel like this a little bit of like a ratcheting sensation where I can feel the resistance of the bearings actually kind of rolling, and it almost feels like teeth in gears that are like well oiled, but I can feel them moving. It's a very different sensation and I like it a lot. It feels really cool and really different, especially for someone who, it's not like I've tried the most knives of anyone in the world, but I've played with a lot of knives. And so to experience a knife where the action is still very good, it's not bad different, but it is noticeably different, just feels cool to me. I like experiencing different things now. Stuff that isn't what everyone else is doing excites me. So I really, really like the action on the Sigil. I like that I have multiple deployment methods. I love to middle finger flick my knives. That is my favorite way to open a knife, just hands down. I also like that it has a flipper in addition. I think if I'm going to have my choice of opening methods, the first one is going to be a hole, because I want to middle finger flick the knife. My second one is probably a flipper tab. I like it better than thumb studs. Holes are greater than studs, and so are flippers, maybe. I guess it depends on the knife at that point, but the fact that I get both here is just a lot of fun. I like having both methods. Now, all of that being said, the Arius has the best action of any knife that I've ever experienced, period. This is what I want in a knife action. Plain and simple. Not everybody appreciates the same type of action that I do. If you're a Sebenza guy who likes a hydraulic, slow roll out knife where you got resistance the whole way but it's smooth, like, more power to you. I don't like that. I don't like that at all. This I freaking love. It's like the way this detent is tuned and the way that these bearings glide and the way it locks up. Everything about this action is the most enjoyable action I've ever played with. The way that it drops shut, as if there's a magnet pulling it down. It's crazy to me how incredible this action is. My first Arius was a Gen 3, and that one, if I had pressure on the lock bar, it didn't want to deploy. So sometimes if I had any pressure back here with my fingers in the wrong spot, and I tried to use the flipper tab, just didn't want to go. And middle finger flicking it wasn't as easy either. This one, the Gen 4 that I have, is just plain and simple the best action on any knife that I've ever experienced with a flipper or with a hole for opening. There's nothing I would change about this. I adore it. So the Arius wins. Sigil, great action as well. And it feels different, it's exciting, it's cool, but this is just untouchable, in my opinion, on action. And I mean, I feel like most people who experience an action or experience an Arius say similar things about the action. Even if it's not their preference, I feel like people usually appreciate how fantastically dialed this knife is. It happens to be exactly what I want out of an action. So for me, clear winner on that category. The Arius wins in action. Now, ergos. Let's keep going. I'll talk Sigil first and then Arius. The Sigil ergos for me are very, very good. I really like the handle profile here. I like the way that this curve is shaped, that I've got this, I guess it's more of a groove than a choil, but it takes my two foremost fingers and even kind of a little bit of my third, but the hump here isn't so aggressive that it's uncomfortable at all. It really does make me feel kind of locked in to this knife, having that shape there, and then it's a nice comfortable, almost flat. It does curve just the tiniest bit there behind that spot, but you can see the way my hand wraps around it. I guess my third finger really does kind of go right on that hump, but it's such a pleasant hump to land on. Like, there are knives where there's a hump that my finger lands and it ruins it for me. Here, it doesn't feel bad at all. I really quite like the way that my fingers feel locked into this spot of the knife. And then the way that this portion of the knife, the kind of spine of the handle, if that's the proper term at all, the way that that rests in my palm feels great. All the edges everywhere on the knife are chamfered well. It's not overly round and slick and slippery, but it's all the corners are knocked down very well to where it's very comfortable. And then the jimping on here, I'm usually very, very critical of jimping. This jimping is done well. I wouldn't mind if this knife had no jimping, but if there's going to be jimping, I want it to be like this, because I really like how far forward the jimping extends, so that in a saber grip, when my thumb is all the way up here, that it does still reach that. That's where the jimping should be. If it's where my thumb is going to actually land, that's a good thing. And it's not too aggressive. This jimping is soft enough that it's definitely giving me more traction. It's not like it's doing nothing, but it's not trying to like cut my finger either. I don't like aggressive jimping. I feel like it's a stupid thing on most knives. yeah, you get a little bit of a guard from the flipper tab. That's got some jimping on it as well, but again, not aggressive enough to even bother like my knuckle right where it lands. It just feels very, very good to me. So I like the ergos on here as a whole. It's good for me in a draw cut, hammer grip, saber grip, reverse grip draw cut is even okay. Like, but any grip that I put this knife in, it feels good to me, and so ergonomically, it's a win. The Arius, ergonomically, for me, is bordering on perfect. There's a reason why this knife is my favorite knife, admittedly. To me, the ergos of a folding knife, I've experienced really, really good a lot of times, but this is the best I've experienced on a titanium frame lock folding knife for sure. The way that this handle swells, and you get this nice curve here that fits my fingers perfectly. Just 2 fingers, third one lands on that flat, right? And then you've also got this curve here for my palm. All of that coming together, partnered with the way that these scales are rounded. Come on. The way that they're rounded a little bit. I don't know if that's focusing or not, but they're contoured, and then all the edges are so meticulously milled and knocked down and softened. Even if you look right up here where the lock bar is cut, usually this corner can be pretty sharp on a lot of titanium frame locks. I don't know if you can see that. They knocked down that corner. They put a little cut there just so that is softened. It's like every single little detail, anywhere that could potentially be a hot spot for anybody, they addressed it, and it feels molten in my hand. It's kind of like, I don't know, if you grab like a fistful of Play-Doh and squeeze it, and it makes like just like the perfect mass inside of your fist that's shaped by the way you squeezed it. This is the closest a folding knife has ever felt like that to me, where it's like, it feels like I squeezed a soft medium and it filled my hand the way my hand wants to be filled, and then you used that as a mold to create this handle. It's just, for me, so good. I love the ergos of this knife. I like that they didn't mess around with any jimping anywhere on the knife other than some on the back spacer, which I don't feel at all. To me, it more just looks decorative than anything, gives it some dimension. That never bothers me. And then especially on this kind of thumb ramp, there's no jimping, and it's a nice, good, kind of wide, flat spot for my thumb to sit. And I just, in a saber grip, I can't beat this knife. It feels absolutely phenomenal. There's a tiny bit of jimping on the flipper tab for deploying the knife, which does help this knife deploy more reliably. And the way that it's positioned when I'm holding the knife, it really, my finger doesn't even quite touch it. The angle of it is just really well thought out to where it's coming off of where my finger lands. So ergos are going to be a win to the Arius. I really like the Sigil. The ergos are very good for me. I don't even really have any complaints about those ergos. These are just nailed for me. So next is fit and finish. Both of these knives, we're playing with really similar constructions here. They're both titanium frame locks. They're both running on bearings. They both, to me, feel very tight and dialed. Both of them are perfect on centering. Both of them have fantastic lockup. The Sigil in particular, I mean, I don't know what else to say about the fit and finish other than I've kind of already addressed by talking about other topics. It's a very well-made knife, very dialed in, and it has a quality, like there's a sense of quality when you feel this knife, when you play with it. It feels very, very nice. Really good internal milling. It's not the most extensive internal milling I've ever seen in terms of like the depth that they put into it. I feel like they maybe could have gone a little bit deeper and removed a little more weight, but I mean, it's not nothing either. They really have they've milled out most of the interior of this knife, and there's nothing I look at on here and think like, oh, they really should have taken that further. I mean, it's done really, really well, and it's an excellent show, I think, of Microtech's capabilities with titanium frame locks, because it's not a game they play a lot. I struggle to think of other titanium frame locks that they've even made. So the fact that this one is so nice, and in my mind they're kind of an out the front automatic knife company, it's a good sign that they're capable of this kind of thing. The Arius, on the other hand, in my opinion, it just, the way I feel, I think this is the nicest American-made production knife currently in existence, at least that I've experienced. I've played with Chris Reeves, I've played with Hinderers, I've played with Striders. I know there are some other small companies out there, and so there are more I still need to experience, but of the ones that I have experienced, in terms of the fit and finish, the tolerances, the way that this knife functions, comes together, feels, the attention, like I mentioned in Ergos, to every single surface of the knife, this is Hall of Fame, in my opinion. It is so freaking good how much attention they've put into every tiny detail on this knife. And one thing I like is this is the most basic version, essentially, that you can possibly get. These handle scales look relatively plain, right? These are pretty restrained design-wise. They do some that have kind of a milled pattern in them. They do others in totally different materials. But for this being just their most basic titanium slab handle that they make, the fact that it's got just this little bit of rounding to it, that all of the chamfers and scallops, or whatever you want to call it, everything is just perfect to me. I have to give fit and finish to this. Again, Sigil's very good. It's playing the game excellently well, but this one, I feel like when I look at them side by side, I can tell which one I think is a better made knife. From what I can see and perceive and feel and smell and taste, the Koenig feels nicer. And one thing that also makes me feel that way, if I'm being totally objective and honest, when you look at the size of these knives, closed, granted, the Sigil is getting more blade length, right? 3.75 inches over here versus 3.5 over here. But the Arius looks bigger to me, to the naked eye. When you look at these knives, the Arius looks bigger. They both run a pretty thick blade stock. The Sigil might be a hair thicker, maybe not even. But the Arius is noticeably lighter in hand. And again, we're playing with titanium frame locks in both cases. And the fact that the Arius looks thicker and more robust, but ends up being lighter because of how insanely good the milling is internally. Like, the amount of material they're able to get out of this titanium without poking through the other side is crazy. It's a testament to the tolerances that they hold. It's just, it goes that extra little bit. The fact that this knife feels noticeably lighter to me when I hold them both, and it looks bigger in a lot of ways. Again, blade length is a little shorter, but overall, the Arius looks to me every bit as big and heavy as the Sigil does, but you pick it up and you can tell it's lighter. So I think that goes a long way. So fit and finish is going to go to the Arius. Next, we have value. For value, I think it's important to reiterate the pricing on this one. We said this is about $400 is what I'm calling it. For that, you get really good titanium. You get a stainless lock insert. You get an over travel stop made of copper, which is pretty cool. You get a milled titanium pocket clip. You get internal milling. You get awesome external milling. You get a great titanium backspacer. You get 3.75 inches of LMAX. I happen to really, really like LMAX. You get good finishing. You get bearings. Like, all of the materials we're playing with here make it feel like it's worth the $400 price tag for sure. If this knife was $500, I wouldn't necessarily think they're that out of line compared to what their competitors are charging for an American-made knife of these materials and this caliber. So I think the value is actually kind of there. Again, if on secondary these cost way more now, that's a little bit of a different conversation based on, I'm going off of what I can see pricing is online, which was what, $390. So for $390, I feel like the materials, the fit and finish, all of that, I don't have an issue with, not one bit. I've spent more for arguably less. Now here on the Arius, we're talking a couple $100 more, right? $200 difference. That's another nice knife. You could buy a really nice Spyderco for $200. So there should be a lot more happening here. In terms of the composition, again, we have titanium backspacer that's finished very well, milled titanium pocket clip, we've got a stainless steel over travel stop and lock insert, we have internal milling again, we've got nice hardware. This one is M390, which many would argue is better than LMAX. I happen to like both steels. I do think M390 does have a little bit of an edge over LMAX, but LMAX has a cooler name. So I've always had an affinity for LMAX. Anyways, this one, yeah, you're probably getting what would be considered a slightly better steel. And other than that, all the materials are identical in terms of what they're using to make this knife. This one, I do feel like there is definitely more technical prowess in the way it's machined and put together. Like I just explained in Fit and Finish, I think this knife has a little bit more impressive work put into it to get it to this final product. But at the end of the day, is it a $200 difference in what goes into it to make this? I think I have to give value to the Sigil because they're both functionally fantastic knives that have amazing appearance, and they're just fantastic. And so the fact that it's that big of a price difference between the two of them, even if I prefer the Arius to the Sigil, I don't know that I can say with a straight face that I think it's worth $200 more. Again, that's based on the prices I can see. If Microtech runs more Sigils in 2020, whereas this one was made in 2017, I think that might have been about the last time that they were made. If they made more now, they might be charging $500 for them, and then it's a $100 gap, and that's a different question. So, based on what I can see pricing-wise online right now, this being about $600, this being about $400, it's going to go to this one on that category of value. Next is carry. So, both these knives, as I already kind of demonstrated, are about the same dimensions. They're really, really close in dimensions. So in the pocket, they both feel about the same amount of comfortable to me. Come on, focus on the knives, not my face. There we go. You can see the thickness actually, to me, looks about the same too. The Arius might be just a hair thicker because those scales are contoured. But yeah, they pocket similarly, in my opinion. The Arius is a little bit lighter, but yeah, this one's hard to call. I will say, neither of them have like my favorite pocket clip in the world. The Arius clip, it's not super deep carry. I put up with it because when people see that sticking out of my pocket, if they know knives, they know it's an Arius. And I don't mind people knowing that I carry an Arius because I love this knife and I am proud of it. But I would prefer it. I prefer deep carry clips, so I'd prefer this one if it was deep carry, right? That's just the reality. But that being said, it goes in and out of pocket well. The way that this pocket clip functions, I don't have any issues with. Feels good in hand as well. So it's like it's a pocket clip I can kind of get behind. If I'm going to not have a deep carry clip, this one looks really good to me. It fits the vibe of the knife. It also, the hole in it relates to the hole inside, like on the side of the knife too. So it's a window into the internals. You can see the blade passing through that. I think that's kind of cool that you've got this window into the knife there through the pocket clip. It's just lined up well. It looks good. So I like this pocket clip. This pocket clip is probably one of the few weak points of the knife for me. It's not the worst milled titanium pocket clip I've ever had. It's not uncomfortable or sharp anywhere, which is a big win. If a clip is like really sharp and snaggy and like can slice my finger if I run across it the wrong way, then I'm out. I don't like pocket clips that have sharp corners and stuff. That's a problem. This one feels good in hand, and it's a nice pocket clip aesthetically. But I will say, like, going in and out of pocket, this one just has like too much tension. It's really, really tight. And for that reason, it's just not as pleasant to put in and out of pocket as the Arius. So the fact that in pocket they feel almost identical to me, neither of them are deep carry. They both have about the same amount of knife that sticks up out of pocket. I think the deciding factor is going to be that functionally going in and out of pocket in actual EDC use, carrying this knife, pulling it out to use it, putting it back in, this clip just functions a hair better for me. So I've got to give it to the Arius on carry. Plus it's a little lighter, which helps. The last one is going to be cutting performance. So the blade on this one, we have a 1/4 inch advantage. 3.75 inches versus 3.5 on the Arius. Both of them come very sharp. They have good factory edges. Asterisk, I'm going to come back to that, but they come with sharp factory edges that do slice fairly well. This one gets pretty thin behind the edge. It's not the thinnest knife behind the edge that I've ever felt. It is a flat grind, but it feels like a good profile for how robust this knife is overall, and being like a little bit tactical, being a Microtech, and just kind of, I get a bit of a tactical sense from this knife. It gets slicey enough, and it does cut very well. I haven't done extensive cutting with this knife because it's a loaner, and it's a very nice one that I'm not willing to risk damaging. So I've done a little bit of paper to see how it feels through paper, and a little bit of cardboard to see how it feels doing a continuous cut through a medium like cardboard. And it does well. It slices for the thickness of this blade, for the proportions of it, quite well. Now the Arius, mine happens to be wearing an edge that was not put on by the factory. One of the critiques of the Arius that I agree with, frankly, is that the factory edges that they put on are just a really intense angle. I forget, I think it was my buddy Jason was saying the angle on his was like 20 degrees per side. Maybe even more than that. No, it was more than that. It might have been like 25 degrees per side or something. So the edge inclusive was just, it was a very like thick, stout edge, and I'm not quite sure why they do that. The Arius gets pretty thin behind the edge because this hollow grind is tall, and not only does it get thin, but it stays thin, and it's the grind on the knife in general is phenomenal. But I will have to agree that the factory edge they put on these is a bit abrupt. So this one is resharpened, and now it cuts better than the factory edge did on my Gen 3, or from what I've seen on the Gen 4s. The way I bought this one, it had already been sharpened by the previous owner, and he did a great job on it. It's got this really good mirrored edge, which is a more appropriate angle. And so the way this one sits right now, it cuts as good, maybe even a hair better than the Sigil does. But I'm going to go based off of the factory edge because I think that's the fairest thing to do. And the way that this one was sharpened from factory, and the fact that you get a little extra blade length for essentially the same size handle, I feel like utility-wise, the cutting performance on both of these is very good. I carry and use my Arius, and I love cutting with it. It is a fantastic knife for knife things, not just to look cool and post on Instagram. This is a great knife, but you get just that a little bit more cutting edge there. The Wharncliffe blade shape, it might be a little polarizing. Some people prefer having belly. Others prefer having this. That's kind of a preference thing. But you get more cutting edge. The edge that comes from factory is a little bit better. And I don't know. I think I have to kind of give it to the Sigil. Close, like a lot of these categories are. But I think the Sigil is a slightly better cutter. So where does that leave us? Looks was a tie. Here, I'm going to put these the way that I started with them. So I've got the Arius on my left, the Sigil on my right. Looks was a tie. Action went to Arius. Ergos went to Arius. Fit and finish went to Arius. Value went to Sigil. Carry went to Arius. And cutting went to Sigil. So we have a 5-3 victory. Arius over Sigil. And I think that seems about right to me. The Sigil deserves some points in this fight. It is a phenomenal knife. And especially if you can have one for the $390 or whatever that I saw on Blade HQ's site today. I don't know if that's still the case on them. These could go for $600 now, which then it's a different question. But neither of them are that easy to get. A lot of the complaints I hear about the Arius are that there just aren't enough of them. Koenig can't make enough to keep up with the demand that they currently face on them, and they only have 2 models as it sits right now, although the third one is about to launch, which is a mini Arius, and that's going to make it even harder to get this one because they're going to be making some mini Ariuses and won't have as much time to make as many of these. Plus, a ton of people are going to be freaking out trying to get the mini Arius, which is going to be a whole new hard to get because it's brand new, and there's that is part of the conversation here. But this one also hasn't been made for a while, so it's not easy to get at all. Your only option is the secondary right now, and that all kind of formulates into what I'm not trying to address here. What I'm trying to address here is based on the numbers that I can see online of what these sell or sold for, which one has more chops behind it. And I think the Arius, I mean, it's still my favorite knife. The Sigil hasn't dethroned it. So it would be wrong for me to say that the Sigil beats it. Then I wouldn't have a reason for this to be my favorite knife. This deserves to win, in my opinion. The Koenig is my favorite knife for so many reasons, and a lot of them got talked about right here. I've done a full review of this knife. I've been using and carrying it ever since that time, and I adore having this knife in pocket and using it. But I really, really want a Sigil. It deserved the 3 points that it got in this little battle that they just did. So I think this was a fun one. I hope you guys enjoyed watching it. Both of these knives are knives that I would have no issue recommending to anybody who has the means to spend what these cost. They are fantastic titanium frame locks that are borderline artistic. They look phenomenal. They functionally are fantastic tools. They're built well, and they have great materials. There's nothing about these knives that would preclude me from recommending them to anybody. So I guess that'll be that. The winner in this one is going to be the Arius, and of course it is. I adore this knife. Am I a little bit biased by my preferences? Of course. This was a battle of my preferences. This is not a scientific endeavor. So if you disagree with the results, more power to you. You're welcome to do this same video from your perspective, and I would be glad to watch it and see what other people think. But don't jump down my throat because I picked the winner that I like better. That's what this whole thing is. So there you have it. The winner in this case is the Arius. Appreciate you guys watching. Thank you so much for taking the time. And this probably turned into a bit of a long one. I can't see how long it's been on the camera, but if you watched all the way through, you are awesome. I appreciate you, and hopefully there was some value in it somehow. It was fun for me to do regardless. Thanks, guys. I'll talk to you soon.